Well, this is the third part of our history of the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church, looking first at the Presbytery of Antrim. Now, it's important to remember that the Presbytery of Antrim is only one element in the parts that make up the whole church, but it's also the oldest part. It is a venerable and ancient institution founded in 1725, and this plate was presented to the Reverend William Macmillan by the International Association for Religious Freedom to recognise the important contribution made by the Presbytery of Antrim on the occasion of its 250th anniversary, now almost 50 years ago. But we're looking at the origins of the Presbytery, and at the moment the theological tensions that existed in the years before, which, although they weren't a direct cause of the creation of the Presbytery, fed into the problems that grew up around the issue of subscription a little bit later on. But some of these arguments actually came into Presbyterianism from the Anglican Church. And we begin today by looking at the Reverend Samuel Clarke. Now, Samuel Clarke was the rector of St. James's in Piccadilly, just up from Trafalgar Square in London. And he was a sort of Don Cupid of his time. He was a very radical and forward-thinking Anglican theologian. And Anglicans too like to look at the Bible afresh, free from any extraneous ideas and confessions from outside. And so Samuel Clarke went through the whole of the Bible looking for the doctrine of the Trinity. And inevitably he couldn't find it. And in 1712 he published his book, his most famous book, The Scripture Doctrine of the Trinity. And so the suggestion was that Jesus had an exalted place, but he was not co-equal with the Father. And these ideas did the rounds amongst leading thinkers, and particularly within the dissenting congregations. But this is a few years after Thomas Emlyn, and Thomas Emlyn isn't influenced by Samuel Clarke because he comes before him. But what happens to Thomas Emlyn is extremely oppressive. So on Easter 1703, Thomas Emlyn is charged not actually with heresy, but with publishing a blasphemous libel that the blessed Jesus has declared himself not to be the supreme God or equal to the Father. So again, this is quite an abstruse area of theology, but the trial goes to court in Dublin, and technically publication was not proved, and there was nothing to support the charge of blasphemy. But the jury bring in a verdict of guilty. Now, Thomas Emlyn is given the chance to retract, but he won't. And Joseph Boyce, who has really instigated the proceedings against Emlyn by bringing them to the attention of the Synod of Munster, I think, regrets having done that and presses for clemency. But the sentence that's handed down is really quite draconian. He is sentenced to a year's imprisonment, and on top of that, he is to stay in prison until he has paid a fine. And the fine is £1,000. Now, in 1703, £1,000 is a colossal amount of money. And Emlyn was a reasonably wealthy man, but this is a ridiculous fine. It's very difficult to assess exactly how much £1,000 is worth today, but guesses there are various sites, and the higher sort of estimates, which we can take as probably being close enough. The highest sort of estimates are it's the equivalent to about £450,000. So getting on for £500,000 is fine. This is an enormous fine. And after he's let out of prison, he has to walk around the four courts in Dublin with a placard around his neck declaring his crimes. Bishop Benjamin Hoadley, the latitudinarian Anglican bishop who we've already encountered and who we will encounter again, he says of the affair surrounding Thomas Emlyn, to place the son below his own father in any degree of real perfection, this is an unpardonable error, so unpardonable that all hands were united against that unhappy man. And he found at length that he had much better have violated all God's commandments than have interpreted some passages of Scripture differently from his brethren. The nonconformists accused him, the conformists condemned him, the secular power was called in, and the cause ended in an imprisonment and a very great fine. Two methods of conviction about which the gospel is silent. Eventually, one of Thomas Emlyn's friends managed to get the ear of the Lord Lieutenant and managed to get the fine reduced to a still very large but more manageable £70. Yet, even after doing that, the primate of Armagh, the Archbishop of Armagh, still insisted that he was entitled to a shilling in the pound of the original fine, and so this had to be paid as well. But eventually Emlyn was released in 1705. So Thomas Emlyn went to London and established his own small congregation and became a pioneer of what came to be known as Unitarianism. But he founded no movement at this point, and certainly not in Ireland. He left Ireland, but he had two important legacies, or the whole business surrounding him had two legacies. One was that it certainly discouraged anyone from expressing Arian views. It discouraged anyone from writing about the exact nature of the Godhead, of the relationship between Christ and God. And secondly, it encouraged the General Synod of Ulster to make subscription to the Westminster Confession compulsory for all entrants to the ministry, and this they did in June 1705. Now, in doing this, they were also following a tendency within the Church of Scotland, which had made subscription to the Westminster Confession much tighter. And again, this is partly powered by fear of Arianism or unorthodox theological views. It's also in Scotland motivated by an awareness of the movement towards the Act of Union. And the one thing that the Scots don't want is to see their church corrupted by English practices, by which they mean the Church of England. So it's very, very important in Scotland to establish a basis for the Scottish Church that is very clearly defined, which has nothing to do with the kind of Episcopalianism which they knew was the normal practice in the South, particularly as they moved towards union. So there was an extra impetus that was really important, powering the Westminster Confession in Scotland. But in Ireland, Presbyterians are following the pattern of the Scots, but they're also very concerned to stop things like Thomas Emlyn's ideas coming to the fore. But as we've seen, this resistance to confessions is something spread across Europe. And it's coming because of this desire for people to use their own reason to engage personally and directly with Scripture and with their understanding of faith. It's connected to, in Ireland and in England, with an awareness that their rights as dissenters, as Presbyterians, are not fully competent within society. There are lots of concerns about their legal position. And as they have come out of Episcopal establishment, as they've rejected the authority of the Church of England or the Church of Ireland, so also they have a natural inclination not to be subject to a new set of rules and authorities when they believe they are freer than that. This is one of the other impetuses. Now, non-subscription is bound up with these notions that nobody can tell you what to do. And this is really, it's a theological question. It's more correctly termed New Light at this point, and we'll look at the idea of New Light theology a little bit later. But it's also about not being told what to do by any authority. And this takes quite a practical turn slightly before the subscription controversy breaks, because John Abernethy is without doubt the most able, most clearly qualified of all the ministers in the north of Ireland. And he's the minister at Antrim, and he's very committed to his ministry at Antrim. But the synod want him to move to Dublin, because obviously there are advantages in having very, very articulate and able ministers in Dublin. But he resists this move to Dublin, resists it very strongly. And technically, the synod probably didn't have the right to move him to Dublin anyway, since Dublin wasn't within their own bounds. But he was given a call by the congregation of Ushers Quay. Now, this is different to the Wood Street congregation we've already encountered. And in Dublin, there are different streams of church, Presbyterian church life. The Wood Street represents the non-subscribing tradition. Ushers Quay represents a more evangelical commitment. But Abernethy does not want to move to Dublin. Eventually he goes for 3 months, but he comes back to Antrim, and there are lots of people trying to keep him in Antrim, and his friends oppose this move to Dublin. And at this time, and this is just before the subscription controversy starts, virtually all the ministers, all the prominent ministers, whether they become subscribers or non-subscribers, support him in this decision. But he refuses to go to Dublin. And he concluded in his diary, or he confided in his diary, according to James Duckle, his biographer after he died, he wrote in his diary that the argument put forward by those who want him to move to Dublin, the argument depends upon servile notions of ecclesiastical power, which are attended with confusion and fear, but without light, and they destroy a rational choice. So this was part of the attitude, this idea of avoiding or combating servile notions of ecclesiastical power. And everyone is with him really at this point. But at about the same time, John Abernethy reads Bishop Benjamin Hoadley's sermon before the king, which he preaches in 1717. And Benjamin Hoadley is questioning the authority of church authorities to the king, and it sparks something within Abernethy. And so Abernethy's sermon, preached in 1719, is what really kicks off the subscription controversy. It's really a passage about eating meat that's been offered to idols in the pagan world. But Abernethy uses it in his own time, and in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, it says, "Let all be fully convinced in their own minds," putting this emphasis on personal responsibility. It followed on from the previous problem over the attempt by the Synod to move him to Dublin. And with this emphasis on individual decision went an increasing questioning of the place of creedal formularies. With them, the authority of the ecclesiastical bodies that upheld them, something that he lifted directly from Benjamin Hoadley. But for Presbyterians, it meant that the traditional criticisms that they had directed first at the papacy, then at Episcopalian churches, were now directed at their own synods and at the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, this is just a theoretical point in 1719, but it all changes in 1720 when a new minister is to be installed in Belfast in the person of the Reverend Samuel Halliday. Now, in the early 18th century, Belfast is a very Presbyterian town. The majority of the population are Presbyterians, and the town is growing. The first Presbyterian congregation is established in the 1660s, and they build a meeting house somewhere on North Street. We don't know exactly where, we don't know what it looked like. And then later they build a new meeting house in 1695 on Rosemary Lane. And this is the original Presbyterian congregation in Belfast. By the time of 1706, the congregation is growing. The minister at the time is a man called John McBride, who, as with all the ministers in Belfast at the time, all the Presbyterian ministers, is a very fierce proponent of Presbyterian rights and not afraid to go head to head with the leaders of the Anglican communion to try and fight for their rights and establish their rights. John McBride isn't a non-subscriber. He's of a previous generation. He is, however, a non-juror. He refuses to take the oath of abjuration, and this is an oath which all public figures were required to take, declaring that the pretender, that is the son of James II, had no right or title to the crown. Thomas Witherow puts it very well. This is quite an interesting aspect of McBride's character. There were very few ministers who refused to take it, but McBride didn't feel he could take it, even though they were very staunch supporters of the revolution and the succession that had come about from James II being deposed. But Thomas Witherow says, "The form of the oath was so worded that as they conceived it, they were bound by it not only to defend the episcopal establishment, but to swear that the pretender was not the son of his reputed father, a matter with the true state of which they could not profess to be acquainted." So John McBride wouldn't sign the oath and consequently had to disappear to Scotland for a number of years, which started to get on the nerves of many of the Presbyterian leaders, especially when the congregation was getting so large. So in 1706, it split in two like an amoeba, and the second congregation was built immediately behind the first on Rosemary Street. And the first church, judging from the picture on McClanahan's map, appears to have been a large two-storey T-shaped meeting house, pretty much like the meeting house of our church in Downpatrick today. The second congregation's initial meeting house appears to have been cruciform in shape, and probably something like the Presbyterian church in Killinchy, which is still there today, which itself is sort of cruciform shape, a variant on the traditional T-shaped pattern that was used very much by Presbyterians. But here we have this very centre of Belfast, this burgeoning, growing Presbyterian community with two meeting houses. And from 1706, the minister of the second congregation is James Kirkpatrick, another very vigorous exponent of Presbyterian church rights, but also undoubtedly from the start a non-subscriber. 1719, they need a new minister in First Church, and the man they call is Samuel Halliday, another extremely well qualified and extremely well educated minister, and a person in this case who is very well acquainted with everything that's going on across Europe, mainly because he's been there. He's also very well acquainted with what's going on in England and with Scotland too. And he's also a non-subscriber. And when they bring him to install him as the minister, he refuses to subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And here is the starting point for what results in this division between subscribers and non-subscribers in 1725. And we'll look at exactly what happens in our next talk.